Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and this is Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, leave a comment. Check out our website, www.superstitionmountains.com. The only place for 4 years that there's an original new video every Monday. Think about that. Everybody else can play around and reboot and you know what? It's always some fresh new product, right? So at least it's something you've not quite heard before, which is a good thing. This week, I'm doing a little something different. It's something we touched upon. It's been questions have been asked. We catch some of this during the lives and stuff. People always ask me in person. I wanted to get this kind of like once and for all. Now, you can always say, who are the top 10 Dutch hunters of all time? And people can throw out, Barry Storm or Chuck Ayler. They can throw out Al Morrow. They can throw out different names. Problem is, I never met any of these people. So I don't know their knowledge and background. I know what I read from them. I can know certain details, notes, what I can research to some degree. But if you're asking me personally of the people I've met and known, that I can give you very easily because I know them. I've spent a lot of time around them. I've spent time in the mountains around these people. I've spent time in the mountains with these people. So that adds a different level to it because I know these people. I kind of have a better understanding, and I know kind of their grasp of how they see the superstitions. Now, they're not always all Dutch hunters. They can be Dutch hunters, but their base knowledge on the Superstition Mountains is just plain and simple, much beyond. And I'll give a top 10, and there's a few people that wouldn't want their names listed. And I kind of thought, could put them in there, and I kind of thought about it because there was about 15 names. But some people probably don't want their name just thrown out there. They lead pretty quiet lives. They don't write books. They are very knowledgeable. They're people that come out to the rendezvous, but they really aren't looking to draw any attention to themselves. So I kind of thought, out of respect and friendship, I would kind of not even consider, and it's just a couple people really. But here I'm going to start with number 10, and these are the people that I feel. And you have to remember, it's people I know, I've spent time with, people I respect a great deal, and at times I've spent much time in the mountains with. Number 10 on this list is a gentleman we've talked about before, and very, very knowledgeable. He probably spent as much time in the Superstition Mountain Historical Society archives and going through the Greg Davis collection and other stuff as anyone. He had ridden in the mountains with Tom Collenborn and Greg Davis and a number of other people. And most anyone knew him pretty well within the community. It was our late great friend Dan Hopper. Dan knew so much, and yet people didn't even have an idea of how much Dan knew. He was such a down-to-earth guy. I always enjoyed sitting around talking with him and spending time with him, and I miss him very much. But Dan would come in number 10 because he just always, so many places, so many things I learned from Dan. Number 9 is another gentleman that just this last year I got to see again for the first time in a number of years. Goes way back, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves. But if you read a number of books, you'll see his name pop up all over the place, and his name is Dick Walp. He spent so much time in the mountains. And anybody that's ever met him, one of the nicest guys there is. Even up into his 70s, he was still a bit of a mountain goat. But always enjoyed talking with him. And another one of those really sweet gentlemen. You ever get a chance, and he doesn't get out of much anymore and all, but just one of the nicest guys. And I always enjoyed sitting around, and I always learned something from him. We'll get on to the next guy because it's important. And I don't really have a cheat sheet, but it's someone that we actually have interviewed and talked to a bit. And again, such a really super nice guy. And you'll notice that is a common theme. These are really nice, level-headed guys. They don't seek a lot of attention and so forth, but he gets forgotten. And I remember the first time we met, we sat and talked, and he was just blowing my mind with stories and things he was talking about and places he was telling me to go in the mountains. His name is Brian Lickman. And Brian is such a great guy. And I've never heard anything really bad said about Brian for the most part. I mean, he's just, even to this day, such a good guy, and he deserves so much more recognition about at times. He's spent in the mountains, because it's very important when guys spend the mountains. The next guy, he could be higher on the list in some people's opinions, but I've sat around, I've spent a lot of time talking to him. We've talked a lot about the superstitions and about a lot of other things, but he kind of grew up into it and grew inside of that situation is Jesse Feldman. Jesse and I kind of share that growing up in the mountains more, and maybe that's a little bit of how I can be partial to him, but Jesse has an incredible wealth of knowledge of a lot of treasure hunting, but he's always good to sit down and have a good, serious discussion. Remember this, the point being, a serious, good discussion. I've always enjoyed my talks with him, and he definitely deserves to be up in there. So you're looking at it and going, okay, so we're getting to that limit for the top 5 of this group. Next gentleman, a lot of people would say, should be higher. And what I'm partial to is I know he only searched in certain areas of the mountains. He doesn't have the overall knowledge of the mountains the rest of everyone else I'll talk about does. And that kind of changes a bit. But he is the nicest person in the world. And being number 6 on this list is not a hard thing, a bad thing at all. But his name is Clay Wurst. Clay is one of the kindest, sweetest, nicest people. See the theme we're running here? I didn't say Jesse was sweet and kind, but he is a good guy. But Clay is so down to earth, and I love talking about him, not only about Dutch hunting and the superstitions, but by life. But Clay focused on certain areas that he was right from the start almost just interested in, and he's stayed very true to that vision. So when you're talking overall the superstitions, I was very surprised when Clay and I would sit and talk, and I would talk about certain areas of the mountains, and he wouldn't be as familiar. And we'd talk at length about them, and he knew the area. He just never spent any time there. And it kind of changes that, because I've always thought the guys that have the full rounded thing. So it's not taking anything away from Clay. It's just simply he was very focused. The areas of Peters Mesa and Pistol Canyon, Peters Canyon, you start talking about LaBarge and up in Squaw. In certain areas, he's just absolutely rock by rock detailed. And then you get him into other areas in the southeast in certain spots, and he just didn't spend as much time. And there's a number of people he just, because he didn't move into those areas, he didn't spend time with. So it's not a bad thing. Now, the next person is probably could be higher in a lot of people's estimation. He's not considered much of a Dutch hunter, but his name is Jack Carlson. And Jack wrote the hiking guides with Mary Stewart. And they usually get put together, but I've spent time out there with Jack. Again, such a nice guy. And I love having phone conversations with him and insight. Jack is so good at describing where to go, how to go, and whatnot. Not even in the book, just over the telephone. I think everybody that knows him has spent time with Jack, just loves Jack to death. And if you spend time with Jack, not trying to convince him you found the Lost Dutchman and your solution to stone maps, but listen to the man, you'll learn so much about the mountains. I've learned so much about how to prepare and spend time in the mountains from Jack. And he's covered on foot almost every square inch you can think of. And I love that. And if you talk to him about something he hasn't been, next thing you know, he's out there in that area. So you have to put Jack in there, and just absolutely assuredly. Now, number 4. Important individual to me. He spent a lot of time, and it's where we approach with these next individuals is they spent a certain amount of time in the mountains. But in number 4, I'm going to put Greg Davis. I don't know how much time Greg spent in the mountains alone. He spent a lot of time out in the mountains with almost everybody on this list. But I don't know if Greg was kind of a loner, kind of solo guy. And we've never talked about it as well as I've known Greg, and it's something I'm going to have to talk to him about, is I don't know if he ever spent a significant amount of time alone in the mountains, which is very different. Clay and I, a number of us, I know Ron Feldman and I had that discussion, and Jesse and I, when you spend time in the mountains by yourself more and more, it kind of is a little different thing than the guys that spend it out there with their teams or their groups and whatnot. You have a different perspective, a different view, and a different feeling about things. So Greg only just comes in at 4 because of that, because I'm just not sure. As far as wealth and depth of knowledge, Greg's one of those people. We're getting into an area where they've forgotten more in life that they've learned about the mountains than they can actually share at times. But I'm always learning something new about Greg, and Greg loved Arizona history as well, so that's always on top of everything. We can talk about so many other things. So we get into that top 3 group, and you're thinking, who are the top 3? And you're kind of knowing who's number 1. I'm thinking. But number 3, I'm going to put in my good friend, Mr. Bob Shoes. Bob spent a lot of time out there with a lot of people, and he spent a lot of time out there traveling around and packing for Crazy Jake by himself. And I've always been surprised more and more as the years have gone by at how much more I learn about his time in the mountains. He tells a certain number of stories repeatedly, but there's times he just starts to, did I ever tell you about the time? And then suddenly I'm like just transported. It's a very, very kind of interesting perspective, because we're talking about someone since the 60s has been back in the mountains and spent a significant amount of time. And with the different people and how he judged people, and I respect the way Bob has been able to kind of, I'm not going to say judge, but how he's read people over the years. He's read people very, very well, very savvy individual, and a very kind person. Again, we get into that kindness. All these guys spend so much time and just sitting and talking to people and listening to some of the oddest things that they'll present to them. And some of that patience has come off on me because they've sat with me. I know Clay has told me time and time again, it doesn't matter how wild the theory is. They believe it in their heart. Give them some time. Give them your ear for a while. So for Clay's benefit, I learned to do more and more of that. Number 2, and we're getting up there, aren't we? And this next individual has a lot of my respect because of what he did in the mountains and the amount of time he spent out there. He spent time out there and people he met. And all of these people, it's the people they met and associated with through their travels over the years. And he's definitely got me on time in the mountains. But very close friend of Mr. Shoes is Ron Feldman. Ron has spent such a significant amount of time in the mountains and made it a part not just of his work and his living. And Ron always has my nod of respect in that. One thing I will say from Ron all the way down and all the way to the top, because we have number 1 coming, is I can sit there and talk with them, and we can talk about the mountains, and we don't need a map. We don't need to point stuff. We don't need to show stuff on our phone. We can just talk and visualize where we're at in the mountains. This boulder, when you go down here and you cut the trail, that big boulder over on the right that has that giant saguaro. Okay, when you turn right around that, have you ever been back? It's funny because I can sit there with these individuals and talk the mountains very intimately without looking at anything. And that's a sign of someone spent significant amount of time in the mountains. Brian Lickman, of when he fell and he broke both of his ankles or whatever happened with him up in Squaw or that area up by Peters Mesa, the same thing. He was telling me where he was going, how he was transporting his gear, and he was like, those boulders, and I was going up there, and I decided to climb, and I was pulling my gear up. And I could actually picture it. And he said, okay, you go down here, and there's a spot, and I could... But they can not only speak in a detailed way, their knowledge of the mountains is they're able to share it, and then I'm able to recognize it. And maybe that's part of what it is. Getting to know these people and talk about these places and these things and be able to learn yourself to be able to talk to them and say, oh, when you go down here and you go around and you do this. Now, there's a few people I left off, and they kind of know who they are, and I talk to them on the phone. And I left them off because they value their privacy. And there will be a time or day, hopefully I would be able to talk and brag about them as well. because they know the mountains, and they come out to the rendezvous, they spend time with us. They just don't want any limelight. They like that being anonymous in the mountains thing, and I don't blame them at all. So they're off this list, but I think they would agree, and everybody I've spoken about, because if any of them would argue, they're just absolutely wrong. Number one on that list is Tom Collenborn. Tom, from the time he was a boy with his father, time with his uncle, the time he spent at the Quarter Circle U, he's worked, lived, breathed everything in the superstitions. He spent a significant amount of time out there. He spent a significant amount of time alone out there, if you don't count the dog and the horse. People will always try to kind of diminish people and stuff, and I've noticed over the years people always try to kind of say certain things to kind of knock something off a little about that. And I'm like, nah, he just knew too many spots. There was no horse would go. And I just understood that as like, you know, sometime when the guy is that guy, and he put the time in. I mean, it's not like he didn't put the time and the effort and the research in. His collection, his knowledge, the breadth of his knowledge to tell you, the, you know, just the ecology of the area, the mineralogy of the area, the people that were there, the psychological side of things. Tom was absolutely brilliant, and I was so fortunate to talk to him about certain things, get off the beaten path of the same old questions I'm sure he was tired of, and talk to him about other stuff, because I was always interested. I wish I would have had another 5 or 10 years to pick away at all that, because that's all you were ever going to do is pick away at it. But every one of these gentlemen I've spoken to, if you meet any one of them, you would be best to sit down and listen. When people start running their mouths, and we're sitting around with some of these gentlemen, and we get into a nice quiet discussion, it's let them talk, because they have so much time and knowledge of the mountains, and they actually intertwine because they've spent so much time together in and out of the mountains. There's no one on that list that I gave that didn't spend time with the others, and that's so important. And there's friendships just built into all that, and they were able to share knowledge but share understanding. And so when people say who are the greatest Dutch hunters of all time, I can only tell you who I know, and those 10 gentlemen definitely a Mount Rushmore to me, because of a lot of faces on that Mount Rushmore, but they were incredible, and I've learned a lot from where I was, from as the time went by, as I met each of them, and then I got out of the dumb question era and got into actually thinking things out because of what was important I needed to ask them, and what did I really need answers for. And I would say very rarely did they tell me X marks a spot, here it is on a map. No, it was more of, I'll explain this to you and you go find it. And I appreciated that because I learned as time went by. So every one of those gentlemen, I just, you know, tip of the hat and a nod. And, you know, Jesse's he's the young pup of the group, but he definitely deserves to be in there. And people would say, hey, you're kind of knocking Josh off there. Well, I've always liked Josh. I just haven't spent the time with him. But Jesse and we've had some really good conversations about stuff and different insights. And Jesse agrees like I do. Everyone can have a different opinion. Everybody can kind of come to feel differently about all this stuff. But hey, it's, you know, it is what it is. And I know the guys that love the mountains compared to the guys that pretend to love the mountains. And those 10 individuals, they're part of the mountains themselves. So there it is. You could leave comments and try to argue it, but nah, there ain't no arguing or moving me off of that mountain. Because those are the guys. And like I said, there's a few other guys, but they're people you wouldn't even know off the top of your head. And I wanted to go with some familiarity with this, but most of all, it is pretty solid where those 10 guys, how they've influenced me and kind of allowed me to learn from each and every one of them. So I thank them from the top to the bottom of that list, and some of them are no longer with us, and that's a shame because of that breadth of that knowledge. But those who are, I still talk to, and I still stay in touch with, and it's always good to see them. Any chance I get to sit around with Ron or Bob or Jack Carlson or Dick Walp, any time I get with any of them is precious now, and I realize how precious it is. So there you go. A little kind of heartfelt there, but at the same time, it's that Christmas season. We want to feel good about things. And we'll get back into the treasure stories, most definitely closing out the year. But that was one that kind of stirred inside of me. Is like, you know, because I do get asked that a lot. Whose books to read? Who's this and that? There's not always books associated with the people, but when you're at the rendezvous and that guy's sitting there and he says that name, keep that name in your head, because when you hear that name, oh, you know, and then ask the right questions, and then just sit back and go for the ride, because you're not going to hate it, man. You're going to learn, and that's the best thing, is to keep the open mind and learn, because that's the biggest lesson I got, is that learn, because these gentlemen have spent their time in the mountains, and after almost basically 50 years in the mountains, I'm learning from them even still to this day. And if you think you got it all figured out through Google Maps or anything else, don't even kid yourself. These guys will run circles around you. So there you go. I hope everybody's having happy holidays. Hope everybody has a great rest of the week. And always remember, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. And this was Chasing Legends.